Heinrich Himmler, one of the indisputable architects of the Third Reich, not only had military ambitions but also a deeper vision, an obsession that mixed ancient Germanic legends with a twisted sense of racial purity. This thin man with round glasses hid behind his insignificant appearance a twisted and dangerous mind. In 1929, when Himmler took control of the SS, it was nothing more than a small group of 280 men. However, in Himmler's mind, this organization was clay that he would mold to create a new elite, a military order that would transcend history, just like the Teutonic Knights of the Middle Ages. The latter had emerged in the 12th century under the name Servants of St. Mary of the German House, swearing chastity, poverty, and obedience while wielding swords under the symbol of a black cross on a white mantle. Himmler was inspired by the brutality of this medieval military order, which was cloaked in a mantle of faith while destroying everything that did not align with their divine vision. From the very beginning, Himmler saw the SS as a tool, a vehicle to materialize his fantasies of a pure Aryan race without mixtures or weaknesses. Under his direction, the SS grew rapidly. By 1933, it already had 52,000 members, all meticulously selected. It wasn't enough to be a fervent Nazi. No. One had to meet the racial purity standards that he himself defined. Anyone who didn't fit the mold was discarded without a second thought. His obsession with Germanic history and mythology led him to seek in the past a justification for his actions in the present. To him, the SS were not mere soldiers. They were a new order of knights, a reincarnation of the Teutonic Knights, those Christian warriors who had fought for the expansion of their faith in pagan lands. However, instead of the cross, these new knights fought for the swastika, and their faith was not in a god but in a Führer. Himmler saw in them the guardians of the Aryan future, those who would protect the purity of the race and ensure Nazi domination over Europe. But he also needed to imbue the SS with a mystical aura, a connection to the supernatural that would give them a sense of purpose beyond the earthly. The race would remain pure and the German spirit would remain immortal. In 1939, the SS seized the Church of the Teutonic Order in Vienna, a symbolic act that linked the past with the present, consecrating the SS as the heirs of that medieval order. But Himmler didn't stop there. He created a set of symbols and customs that solidified the identity of the SS as an elite separate from the rest of German society. The logo of the two lightning-shaped runes adopted in 1932 was one of those symbols. It was a creation of Guido von List, an Austrian occultist who had designed 18 runes in 1906. The original rune, known as Sowilo, represented the sun, but Himmler transformed it into the symbol of Nazi victory. This symbol, loaded with esoteric meaning, became a feared mark throughout Europe. Another symbol that Himmler fervently adopted was the Totenkopf, the death's head, which had already been used by German military units for centuries. However, in his hands, the skull transformed into more than just a military emblem. It was an oath of loyalty unto death, a commitment that every SS member made upon receiving their skull ring. For Himmler, these rings were not mere objects. They were relics that were never to be sold and had to be returned to him upon the bearer's death. Those rings, kept in Wewelsburg, became a perpetual reminder of the dead, a monument to endless fidelity. Traditional German customs did not escape Himmler's reshaping either. For him, Christian rites were inadequate for the new elite. Therefore, he created SS-specific ceremonies to replace the traditional ones. Baptisms were replaced with naming rituals, weddings were transformed into Aryan ceremonies, Christian funerals were supplemented with SS rituals, and the summer and winter solstice celebrations were instituted as central festivities. The ideological indoctrination that he implemented within the SS was not just a tool of control, but a way to give meaning to the most brutal acts. Under Auftragstaktik, Himmler allowed lower-ranking officers to act with terrifying independence, carrying out their orders with a freedom that often resulted in unspeakable atrocities. This tactic ensured that guilt was diluted among the many who participated, creating an army of remorseless killers, each convinced they were fulfilling a sacred duty. And so, under the command of this seemingly insignificant man, the SS was transformed into a death machine, an order of dark knights who sowed terror across Europe, believing they were forging a new world order. Torches and oaths, the ritual of terror in the SS scene. The parades and oaths of loyalty of the Nazi SS were carefully orchestrated spectacles designed to consolidate loyalty and fanaticism within the organization, as well as to project their power to the world. At the center of these events was a dark paradox, the glorification of death and brutality, wrapped in a mantle of rituals and symbolism intended to connect the SS to an almost mythical tradition. This narrative begins in the early 1930s, when Heinrich Himmler began shaping the organization according to his twisted vision of racial purity and military discipline. Darkness descended like a heavy shroud over the cobblestone streets of Nuremberg, where the shadows of thousands of uniformed men stretched out into the dimness. They were the soldiers of the Schutzstaffel, aligned like pawns on a vast chessboard, ready to march under the lit torches that gleamed like poisoned fireflies in the German night. It was 1934, and the city was about to witness one of the most unsettling spectacles history has ever known. Amid the thunder of drums and the echoing of boots marching in unison, the men in black advanced like an unstoppable wave, every step measured, every gaze empty. In the air, the smell of gunpowder and sweat mixed with the stale scent of fear, the kind of fear that Germans had learned to disguise as respect under the watchful eyes of the Führer. There he stood, high above, watching his followers with the eyes of someone who felt like a god, egomaniacal and sick with power. And there, in the dust of the square, the souls of the SS soldiers joined in an oath that chained them to blind loyalty, a devotion that would soon drag all of Europe into the abyss. During those years, the streets of Germany became stages for a macabre theater. The SS, with their imposing black uniforms, marched in perfect formation, parading through cities that gradually fell under the spell of Nazi power. At each parade, the expressionless faces of the spectators reflected a mixture of fear and admiration, while the drums beat a rhythm that echoed like the pulse of a sick heart. The sight of thousands of men, all cut from the same cloth, moving in unison like a machine devoid of humanity, was enough to strike terror into anyone who dared to question the Führer's authority. The climax of these parades came as night fell, when the torchlight turned shadows into dancing beasts. Fire, a recurring element in SS rituals, served as a symbol of purification, but also of destruction. What in other cultures had been a beacon of hope, in the hands of the Nazis became a tool of domination. The torches raised to the dark sky illuminated the hardened faces of the SS, but more than anything, they served as a clear warning, a reminder of the fate awaiting those who dared to resist. Likewise, year after year, the celebration of the SS Gründungstag was a reminder of the founding of that order. High-ranking officers, dressed in their finest regalia, recited oaths that sounded more like curses than words of loyalty, their eyes fixed on the distance. In this way, the parades were not the only reflection of blind devotion to the Führer. The oaths of loyalty, spoken during ceremonies that felt more like religious rituals than military acts, sealed the fate of those who joined the SS. Under the watchful eyes of Himmler and other high-ranking officers, new recruits, dressed in their immaculate uniforms, uttered words meant to bind them for life to Adolf Hitler. With one hand raised in the typical Nazi salute, they swore allegiance not only to the Führer, but also to the cause of National Socialism, an ideology that glorified death and scorned life. The solemnity of these oaths was accentuated by the atmosphere in which they were taken. Medieval castles, places that had once witnessed bravery and honor, now served as stages for the consecration of the executioners of the Third Reich. In these historically charged sites, the SS, clad in their black uniforms with the skull emblem gleaming on their caps, pledged to follow their leader blindly, even unto death. The ceremony, steeped in symbolism, sought to connect the SS with a glorious past, a carefully crafted lie to justify the atrocities that were about to be committed. The design of these events left nothing to chance. From the music that resonated in the air to the smallest detail of the uniform, everything was calculated to create a psychological impact on both participants and spectators alike. The precision with which the SS marched, the steady rhythm of their steps, not only represented military discipline, but also the inexorable march toward the abyss that National Socialism had prepared for Europe and the world. The faces of the SS, hidden behind the mask of discipline and duty, reflected the dehumanization that had been imposed on them. They were soldiers, yes, but not in the service of the homeland or freedom, but of an ideology that had elevated hate and death to the rank of virtue. Watching those parades, hearing those oaths, it was impossible not to perceive the echo of something older, darker. The SS, in their quest for power and purity, were not creating something new. They were awakening a demon that had slept in the heart of humanity for centuries. Beyond the style, the evolution of the SS uniform and its deadly purpose. In the early days of the Third Reich, the uniforms of the Schutzstaffel were rudimentary and barely distinguishable from those of other paramilitary groups that flourished in Germany in the 1920s. They wore simple brown shirts, very similar to the brown shirts of the Sturmabteilung. These uniforms, designed to promote unity and camaraderie, lacked the distinctive elements that would make them stand out on the political and military stage of interwar Germany. The transformation began in 1932 with the introduction of the distinctive SS armband, a white circle with a black swastika in the center, a symbol that had already been adopted by the Nazi Party in 1920, emerged as a defining mark, which encapsulated the mission of the SS, racial purity and unwavering loyalty to Hitler's vision. This first modification was limited to a symbolic touch, but soon a more radical metamorphosis would follow. In 1934, Heinrich Himmler, determined in his purposes, decided that his elite troops needed an attire that reflected their authority and brutality. He commissioned Karl Diebitsch to design a uniform that would be the very definition of discipline and terror. Diebitsch, with the help of Hugo Boss, a clothing manufacturer from Metzingen, sculpted an ensemble that was destined to leave an indelible mark on the German and European psyche. The result was the iconic black SS uniform, designed to be both functional and visually impactful. Inspired by the attire of Bavarian mountain soldiers, the uniform included high boots, breeches, and jodhpurs. The black color not only symbolized mourning but also offered a practical advantage. It hid dirt and wear better than lighter colors. However, the choice of black had a more sinister purpose. It was a color that evoked death and fear, a deliberate choice to instill terror. The insignias that adorned these uniforms were of the greatest impact. On the collar patches were the SS runes, symbols of racial purity and a connection to the occult. The death's head worn on the peaked caps represented the SS's ruthless indifference to human life, and the SS eagle on the right sleeve affirmed loyalty to Hitler and the Nazi cause, an emblem of power designed to inspire both admiration and fear in equal measure. The symbolism of the SS uniform was by no means merely a matter of aesthetics. Each element was carefully chosen to convey a clear message of power and authority. The black color, the elegance of the design, and the ominous symbols were meant to project an image of discipline and professionalism, but they also served as a constant reminder of the organization's brutality. While Hugo Boss is often mentioned in conversations about the design of these uniforms, his role was primarily limited to production. Diebitsch was the true architect of the design, working closely with Himmler to create a look that embodied fear and respect. Boss, who joined the Nazi Party 2 years before Hitler came to power, oversaw the production of the uniforms, which were manufactured in factories across Germany, often using forced labor from occupied countries. The terrifying impact of these uniforms was immediate and profound. The minimalist design and ominous symbols made the uniforms instantly recognizable and deeply unsettling. The elegance and perfection of the uniforms, despite their sinister beauty, served to dehumanize SS members, making it easier for them to carry out their brutal tasks without remorse. The evolution of this uniform, with its meticulous design and terrifying symbolism, helped cement the SS's reputation as one of the most feared and ruthless organizations in modern history. However, as the war progressed, the SS began to adapt their uniforms to different environments and roles. The Waffen-SS, for example, started using variations of the Army's grey field uniform, adorned with SS insignia. The black uniform, though still iconic, became less common in combat situations, as functionality became more important than appearance. The Waffen-SS also pioneered the use of camouflage patterns in their uniforms, reflecting the need for adaptability on the battlefield. Flags of supremacy, the SS emblems and their message of domination. The history of the SS is marked by symbols that represented racial supremacy, while simultaneously instilling visceral fear in all who dared cross their path. It all began in the 1920s when the Nazi Party adopted the swastika as its primary symbol, that ancient emblem which, in the hands of the Nazis, was stripped of its original meaning and transformed into a representation of German nationalist pride and the supposed Aryan identity. Heinrich Himmler was the one who pushed for the incorporation of these symbols into the SS. As early as 1933, after the Nazis seized power, Hitler, pleased with their role in the purge of the SA, announced that the SS would become an independent organization, subordinate only to him. The symbols and uniforms of the SS were not chosen at random. The Nazi flag, designed by Hitler himself, consisted of a black swastika on a white disc against a red background. This color scheme, which evoked the flag of the German Empire, resonated with many Germans who rejected democracy and longed for the return of the glorious days of the imperial past. The swastika, with its ancient roots, was appropriated by the Nazis to represent that glorious past and the powerful renewal of the German nation. Before National Socialism, the swastika was an emblem of well-being and divinity. It was born in such ancient times that its roots stretch back to the Neolithic era, more than 10,000 years ago, when civilizations across the world etched its four right-angled arms onto stones and ceramics. In those distant eras, the swastika was merely a sign of hope, an amulet that promised prosperity and good fortune. In the vast Indian subcontinent, Hindus saw it as a representation of the sun, the light that dispelled shadows, while for Buddhists it was an auspicious footprint, the very steps of Buddha. As humanity advanced, the symbol was adopted by cultures as diverse as the Norse, who associated it with Thor's hammer, and the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome, who saw the swastika as a sign of power and protection. However, in the 19th century, a group of European scholars, armed with flawed racial theories, linked the swastika to a supposed Aryan culture that, according to them, connected Europe and Asia. The SS, with their sleek black uniforms and special insignia, saw themselves as a superior caste, far above the brown-shirted SA stormtroopers with their clumsy discipline. Every element of their attire and symbols was imbued with a dark message. The SS flag, for example, featured a white circle with a black swastika in the center, surrounded by a wreath of oak leaves, a symbol of strength and endurance. It was not just a flag, it was a banner of domination. In fact, the SS flag flew alongside the flag of the German Empire, that black, white and red standard, after Hitler and Hindenburg issued a decree in 1933. This symbolic act was an attempt to connect the Nazi regime with the glorious past of the German Empire, as if the new Nazi Germany were a natural continuation of that imperial power. The Nazis also employed various runes. These ancient marks, which once adorned stones and amulets, had their fate rewritten by an organization that knew how to mold fear and hate into symbols. The Nazis clung to the inventions of a modern occultist, Guido von List, who, with a mix of fantasy and delusion, created the Armanen runes, a distorted version of the original Germanic runes. The most prominent of these runes was the Sig, a stylized lightning bolt that, under the gaze of SS leaders, became an emblem of victory. It was a loose adaptation of Sowilo by Guido von List, as interpreted by Karl Maria Willigut. This mark, which once represented the sun in ancient cultures, was now used to identify those who served the Reich with a blind and terrifying devotion. These runes, now laden with dark meanings and manipulated to serve an ideology of hate, became tools of control and indoctrination. The SS members, shrouded in an aura of mysticism and power, were molded to believe that they were the guardians of an ancestral legacy, a superior race destined to dominate the world. The flags and banners of the SS were proudly displayed at Nazi rallies and events, such as the grand annual parades in Nuremberg. These symbols were not only a reflection of the German people's pride and loyalty to the regime, but also a tool of intimidation, designed to instill fear in the hearts of their enemies. With the end of World War II, SS symbols were banned in many countries, and their display is considered a crime in many cases. However, these symbols continue to be used by neo-Nazi groups as a reminder of a dark chapter in history, a chapter that humanity must not forget, even as some use it to fuel hate and intolerance in the present. Talismans of death, the symbolic weapons and belts that shaped the SS in Nazi Germany. The game of symbolism reached its zenith with the creation and use of symbols that blended the ancient with the modern, the sacred with the profane. The SS found in ceremonial daggers and belt buckles not just tools of war, but artifacts loaded with meaning, designed to shape the identity and loyalty of their members, and above all, to project an aura of terror. Thus was born the SS Ehrendolch, an honor dagger whose design was no coincidence, but a meticulous act of historical manipulation. The choice of a 16th-century Swiss dagger as a model was not a mere aesthetic whim. Switzerland, with its reputation for producing high-quality weapons and its mercenaries famous for their battle prowess, represented everything the Nazis wanted to embody: racial supremacy and military might. The SS could not resist adding a more sinister touch to this creation. They drew inspiration from the Holbein dagger, exhibited in the Munich City Museum, which bore an image of the Dance of Death, a work by the German artist Hans Holbein the Younger. This macabre engraving, where death leads different characters to their inevitable end, resonated deeply with the SS's fascination with the occult and the mortal. It was, in essence, the personification of their mission, to be death itself, leading the unworthy to their fate. The dagger was also designed to evoke the Teutonic Knights, those medieval warriors wrapped in a code of chivalry and loyalty. But instead of defending Christendom, these new knights were dedicated to the Nazi cause. This dagger was not given to officials, they had to earn it, and its presentation during a ceremony was laden with mysticism and fanaticism. In fact, every 9th of November at the Feldherrnhalle in Munich, the ceremony of presenting these daggers was a spectacle charged with ritualism and fervor, invoking an idealized Germanic past that never existed, but that was perfect for the Third Reich's purposes. The SS belt buckle, adorned with the fearsome Totenkopf, did not lag behind in symbolism. The skull and crossbones, an ancient Prussian military symbol, was reinterpreted by the SS as an emblem of racial supremacy and absolute contempt for life. Surrounded by oak leaves, a symbol of strength and endurance, the buckle became a distinctive mark of those destined to impose the new order through fear and brutality. But these daggers and buckles were not mere decorations. Their purpose went beyond aesthetics. They were tools carefully designed to instill in their bearers a sense of superiority and destiny. The dagger, with its sharp blade and dark past, not only cut through flesh but severed any ties with what the Nazi regime deemed inferior or opposed to its principles, marking the SS members as executors of a supreme Aryan destiny. Himmler, with his peculiar vision of honor, had decreed that any SS member had the right and the duty to use their dagger against anyone who dishonored the order or insulted an SS family. The exclusivity of these daggers, reserved only for full SS members, reinforced the sense of elitism within the organization. Those who had been loyal enough before 1933, the so-called old fighters, received a special version of the dagger, adorned with a chain decorated with skulls and runes, a symbol of their status within the hierarchy. High-ranking officers, on the other hand, were awarded golden daggers, turning the act of killing into a golden ritual, a macabre homage to their devotion to the Führer. The belt buckles, on the other hand, served as a constant reminder of the brutality that the SS was destined to deploy. Every time an SS member fastened their belt, they secured not just their uniform, but also their loyalty to the cause, their commitment to the mission of purifying Europe of those deemed unworthy of life. The oak leaves, an emblem of Germanic strength, and the skull, a testament to the ever-present death, were fused into a piece of metal that carried the weight of history and the blood shed in its name. Over time, these symbols became more than mere adornments. They encapsulated the spirit of an organization that saw death and destruction not just as a means, but as an end in itself. The daggers and buckles transformed into insignia of an elite that considered itself above common morality, free to wield power without compassion or remorse. The perversion of these symbols reached its climax in the concentration camps, where the Totenkopf became the last face that thousands of people would see before dying. The SS Totenkopfverbände wore the buckle as a mark of their belonging to a caste dedicated to annihilation. And though the Third Reich fell and its symbols were banned in many places, these artifacts, laden with a symbolism that goes beyond the merely decorative, remain as silent witnesses to the barbarism that once ruled Europe. Industrialized marks of domination, the use of tattoos in Nazi terror. While most of the population at the time associated tattoos with criminals and outcasts, the Nazi regime found perverse ways to employ these symbols in line with their ideology of superiority and discipline. In civilian life, tattoos were a stigma, but in the SS universe they were transformed into marks of status and ruthless control, aligned with their standards of beauty and aesthetics. Starting in 1933, the SS began incorporating tattoos into their disciplinary regime, but not all SS members bore these symbols. The most common tattoos were blood-type tattoos, especially among the soldiers of the Waffen-SS. These tattoos, located on the left forearm, were a pragmatic aberration in a world obsessed with purity. The letters A, B, AB, or O served as a medical utility marker, a desperate measure to facilitate quick transfusions in the chaos of battle. However, in the grim reality of war, where a soldier's life could turn for the worse in an instant, these tattoos became a sentence of identity, a perpetual reminder of belonging to a group that would soon be hunted down. Once the war ended, these tattoos helped identify a few Waffen-SS members to be prosecuted for war crimes. Even among the Allies, it was easy to identify enemies just by looking at their arms. For example, it is known that Heinrich Himmler and other high-ranking SS officers did not have tattoos. Among them, tattoos were unnecessary because they were not on the battlefield. Specifically, German officers who survived World War II often tried to remove their tattoos to avoid identification, either by shooting themselves in the arm or paying doctors under the table. But as the conflict progressed, the use of tattoos in concentration camps became a brutal tool of dehumanization. In October 1941, the Nazis began tattooing serial numbers on prisoners, a practice initially introduced at Auschwitz. The need to reliably identify prisoners became imperative, given the large number of victims and the constant confusion. The numbers, etched with ruthless precision onto the left forearm, became the new way to mark the human body as mere state property. The blue ink rubbed into the bleeding wounds ensured that the mark would remain indelible, a grim reminder of the prisoner's position in the cruel hierarchy of the camp. The introduction of these tattoos at Auschwitz was a physical manifestation of the Nazi contempt for human dignity. The process of applying these tattoos, which included the use of metal stamps and needles, was painful and humiliating. The numbers not only served to identify the prisoners, but also to remind them daily of their stripped identity. Prisoners were reduced to numbers, their names, pasts, and hopes erased by the regime's brutality. On the other hand, tattoos in concentration camps also reflected the power structure within the camp system. Primarily, those bearing the blood-type tattoo were considered part of the elite combat troops, implying a special status within the organization. In the case of concentration camp inmates, lower numbers indicated prisoners who had arrived first, while higher numbers marked those new to the system. For many descendants of Holocaust survivors, replicating a family member's tattoo has become an act of commemoration and a link to history. These tattoos have been transformed into symbols of resistance and memory, a living testimony to a history that must not be forgotten. In each number etched into the skin, in each mark that disfigured the human body, lies a fragment of the nauseating legacy of a system that sought to eradicate the very essence of human dignity. From memento mori to emblem of evil, the dark evolution of the Totenkopf. In the dark paths of history, few symbols have evoked as much horror as the Totenkopf, the skull and crossbones, which in its deepest roots was not always the emblem of death and terror that the world would come to know. Born within the Prussian militarism of the 18th century, this skull crowned with crossed bones first rose as a memento mori, a reminder of the fleetingness of life and the sacrifice in battle. However, fate, always capricious, had other plans for this emblem, condemning it to a dark transformation that would mark it forever. In the decades of the 1730s and 1800s, when Europe was embroiled in wars of succession and imperial conflicts, the Totenkopf adorned the black garments of Frederick the Great's Hussar Regiment No. 5. These hussars, with their dark uniforms and the skull shining on their hats, became a representation of death itself on the battlefield, a warning to those who dared to face the Prussian war machine. Then, in 1809, when the Duke of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel raised his volunteer force to fight against Napoleon, the Totenkopf reappeared, this time as a symbol of mourning and revenge. The Black Brunswickers, with their dark uniforms and their skull emblem, marched to war with death at their backs and blood in their hearts. But those times, though marked by violence, pale in comparison to what the Totenkopf would come to represent under the yoke of the swastika. The rise of Adolf Hitler to power in 1933 was the prelude to an era of darkness for Europe, and the Totenkopf, resurrected from the past, became the perfect emblem for the Schutzstaffel. Julius Schreck was the architect of this resurrection, taking the skull as a symbol of unbreakable loyalty, of sacrifice unto death for the Führer and the German nation. But under the cold gaze of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, this symbol acquired a new meaning, one tinged with fanaticism, cruelty, and contempt for human life. In the concentration and extermination camps that would arise under the administration of the SS Totenkopfverbände, the Totenkopf became the visible face of a regime dedicated to annihilation. The men who wore this symbol on their uniforms were the executioners of millions, the architects of a horror so vast it defies comprehension. These camps, spread across Europe, from Auschwitz to Treblinka, became altars of death where the Totenkopf reigned as a dark god, indifferent to the suffering and despair that surrounded it. The Totenkopf also marched to war, not only in the extermination camps but on the front lines, where the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf made a name for itself, not for bravery, but for its brutality and utter disregard for the laws of war. Formed from the same men who guarded the death camps, this division hurled itself into combat with a ferocity that could only be born from fanatical hatred, a hatred that did not distinguish between enemy soldiers and innocent civilians. In the ravaged lands of France, Russia, and beyond, the Totenkopf left an indelible mark, a trail of blood and ashes that still stains the pages of history. Under the command of men like Theodor Eicke, the Totenkopf division waged a war without mercy, a war where life had no value and death was the only constant. The massacres of civilians, the summary execution of prisoners, and the senseless destruction became its calling card. In every battle, in every ravaged village, the Totenkopf shone with a malignant gleam. However, the Totenkopf was also a tool of indoctrination, a mark that, once adopted, consumed its bearer, transforming them into an instrument of the most absolute evil. Himmler, in his twisted worldview, saw the skull not only as a reminder of death, but as a call to immortality through total sacrifice for the Nazi cause. For him, the Totenkopf was the visual manifestation of a creed in which death, far from being feared, was to be embraced as a sacred duty. The legacy of the Totenkopf is, ultimately, a legacy of horror. Although its origins were far from dark, it was under the Nazi regime that this symbol became the very embodiment of death and suffering. In the years that followed the collapse of the Third Reich, the Totenkopf did not disappear but continued its existence in the shadows, adopted by those who still subscribed to the ideology of hate and death that once ruled Europe. In the hands of neo-Nazi groups and hate organizations, the skull remains a symbol of violence, a reminder that although the Third Reich was defeated, its toxic ideas still persist on the fringes of society. But the story of the Totenkopf is not just the story of a symbol. It is the story of how an emblem can be corrupted, of how humanity, in its pursuit of power and dominance, can transform even the most innocuous ideas into tools of oppression. The skull, once a reminder of mortality and sacrifice, became an emblem of immortality through violence, a warning of what happens when power is handed over to the worst instincts of mankind. Within cursed walls, the dark rebirth of Wewelsburg under the Third Reich. Wewelsburg Castle, nestled in the North Rhine-Westphalia region of Germany, carries centuries of history etched into its walls like indelible scars. The fortress, originally built in the 9th century, witnessed the ebb and flow of German history, from the battles between Germanic tribes and Romans to the splendor of the Renaissance era. However, its name would be forever stained in the 20th century, when it became a dark emblem of Nazi ideology under the fanatical gaze of Heinrich Himmler. In the early 17th century, the castle, then a mere defensive structure, was transformed by the Prince Bishop of Paderborn into a residence in the purest Renaissance style. Its walls, once witnesses to defense against invaders, were covered with stucco and decorations that spoke of an era of opulence and ecclesiastical power. But this splendor would not last. Flames and neglect reduced the building to a ruinous state, almost forgotten by time and history. It was in the 1930s that Wewelsburg regained prominence. Himmler, in his quest to endow the SS with a spiritual and symbolic center, set his sights on the old fortress. The castle, with its unique triangular layout, was chosen not only for its structure but also for its proximity to the legendary site of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, where the Germans had inflicted a crushing defeat on the Roman legions in the year 9. This place was loaded with symbolism that Himmler could not overlook. Thus began the metamorphosis of Wewelsburg under the yoke of the Nazi regime. The renovations were extensive, and no expense or resources were spared, though these resources came from the vilest of sources: forced labor. Near the castle, a concentration camp was established where prisoners from all over Europe were worked to death, their bodies weakened by malnutrition and disease, their spirits broken by the brutality of the SS guards. Within its walls, Himmler ordered the creation of the Hall of the SS Generals and a crypt, both spaces steeped in mystical symbolism. The hall, adorned with the Sonnenrad emblem, an esoteric symbol that Himmler associated with ancient Aryan heritage, was intended to be the place where the highest SS officers would gather to perform rituals that, according to them, would reinforce their connection with the mythical past they so longed to revive. In the crypt, on the other hand, it was planned to honor the fallen members of the SS, as if the place were a sanctuary dedicated to the martyrs of their cause. Himmler's obsession with Wewelsburg knew no bounds. He dreamed of expanding the castle into the center of the world, a colossal complex from which the Third Reich would dominate the planet after its final victory. The plans were grandiose, excessive, reflecting the megalomania of the SS leader. However, these dreams of grandeur were interrupted by the harsh reality of war. As the conflict progressed and defeats mounted, resources began to dwindle, and work on Wewelsburg slowed to a near halt. But the castle's fate was not sealed with the collapse of the Nazi regime. In the final days of the war, as Allied forces approached inexorably, Himmler ordered Wewelsburg to be destroyed so that it would not fall into enemy hands. The destruction was partial. Insufficient explosives and a hasty retreat left the castle in a state of incomplete devastation, like a mutilated corpse abandoned on the battlefield. After the war, Wewelsburg was occupied by Allied forces and later underwent a restoration process that took several years. In 1950, the castle reopened as a museum and youth hostel, an attempt to redeem the place from its dark past. However, the shadow of Nazism was too long to be ignored, and in 1977, it was decided to convert the castle into a memorial, not only to remember the atrocities committed, but also the ideology that inspired them. The Wewelsburg Museum, inaugurated in 1982, began to show the public the hidden reality behind the fortress walls. The exhibited objects, photographs, and documents all told the story of a place that had witnessed the darkest side of humanity. Over the years, the museum has continued to evolve, delving deeper into the study of the ideology and terror that the SS embodied. In 2010, a new permanent exhibition titled Ideology and Terror of the SS was opened to the public, offering an even more penetrating look at how Wewelsburg was used as a tool of Nazi propaganda. The castle also became a place of commemoration for the victims of the Niederhagen concentration camp, where at least 1,285 people lost their lives. A monument was erected in their memory in the year 2000, a silent reminder of the lives cut short by Nazi barbarism. Corrupted femininity: how the women of the Third Reich embraced Nazi brutality. The story of the women in the forces of the Third Reich is one tinged with shadows, ambitions, and a fervor that transcends what the world might understand as rationality. While Europe bled under the Nazi yoke, these women, clad in the severity of a uniform that equaled them in cruelty to their male counterparts, embraced brutality and hatred as part of their essence. The SS Helferinnenkorps thrust them fully into the machinery of death, in roles that seemed small but in reality made them essential cogs in a genocidal engine. This corps represented an opportunity for those who had until then been relegated to the shadows of home and motherhood. This SS division was not a mere support group. It transformed into a squadron of executioners where around 10,000 women found their place, whether as guards in concentration camps or in administrative roles that involved compiling execution lists. These women, mostly young and between the ages of 17 and 30, were recruited through campaigns that appealed to their loyalty to the Reich. They were trained to meet specific physical criteria because in Nazi ideology, appearance was not merely an adornment, but a declaration of racial purity and superiority. Thus, in an era when makeup and jewelry were suppressed as symbols of vanity, the women of the SS adopted an aesthetic that fused military rigidity with a grotesque version of femininity. Their uniforms, designed to mimic those of the men with boots that echoed power and authority with each step, contributed to a presence that was both feared and detested. In 1942, the need for personnel in the concentration camps opened the door for the first female guards in places like Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. The word Aufseherin became synonymous with terror for the prisoners unfortunate enough to fall under the watchful eyes of these women. In women's camps like Ravensbrück, where senior overseers and camp leaders wielded near-absolute power, cruel hierarchies were established. These women ruled with an iron hand, managing forced labor lists and daily roll calls, deciding with a gesture who would live another day and who would not. But they were not mere bystanders. Although mass executions were generally left to the men of the SS, these women were far from innocent. They actively participated in selecting victims and enforcing the camp's ruthless rules. The relationship between the women and men of the SS was complex, a mix of camaraderie and competition. Himmler, the architect of the SS, promoted the idea that female guards were equal to men, a message these women fervently adopted. However, in the darkness of the camps, many sought to prove their worth and loyalty by imitating male brutality. The result was a macabre dance of power where female identity twisted and deformed, becoming a lethal weapon. The uniform they wore, with its riding boots and skirts designed to maintain a semblance of femininity, was much more than clothing. It was a symbol of the iron discipline the regime demanded, a discipline that dehumanized both those who wore it and those who suffered under it. The image of a woman with meticulously groomed hair, adopting rigid militarized postures while issuing death orders, is an image the world has tried to forget, but remains latent in the fabric of history. Any internal conflict these women might have faced, if they ever did, was hidden behind a facade of loyalty and blind obedience. Conforming to the Aryan ideal of beauty was not just a matter of vanity. It was an ideological obligation, a way to empower themselves within a male-dominated system. But this power, which sought to equalize them with their male counterparts, only plunged them deeper into cruelty. Many of them adopted brutal behaviors as a way to prove their worth, becoming as ruthless as the men they sought to impress. Women who did not conform to this standard faced not only social rejection, but also the danger of being deemed unfit for the Reich's mission. Those who did meet this ideal, with their blonde hair and blue eyes, were celebrated as the mothers of the Aryan future, while those who failed were relegated, their opportunities to advance within the Nazi structure significantly limited. The effort to maintain this image of Aryan perfection was accompanied by relentless propaganda. Nazi media not only promoted, but imposed these ideas through a constant campaign that glorified the Reich's racial values. Women within the SS, especially those in positions of power, were forced to conform to this image not only as a way to survive within the regime, but also as a means to exert control and power over others. Thus, the SS Helferinnen Corps and the female guards in the concentration camps were not mere footnotes in the history of Nazism. They were active participants whose actions, though largely forgotten or minimized, were essential to the functioning of the Third Reich's genocidal machinery. These women not only wore immaculate uniforms, but also carried the burden of institutionalized hatred, a hatred that manifested in every order they gave, in every prisoner they marked for death. Nazis on the big screen, the dark allure of evil in popular culture. In the comforting darkness of a cinema, the screen begins to glow, projecting images that have shaped the perceptions of generations about one of the darkest periods in history. The portrayal of the Nazi regime, especially through the lens of Hollywood, has woven a narrative that, despite its pretensions of condemnation, has left an indelible mark on popular culture. From the very first sequences, Adolf Hitler appears as an almost mythical figure, an archetype of absolute evil. In the minds of the audience, his image intertwines with that of the devil, the ultimate antagonist. Hollywood, with its ability to transform complex realities into simplified tales, turned the Führer into a sort of comic book villain stripped of his humanity, which paradoxically made him even more terrifying. Productions like The Man in the High Castle not only explored an alternate history in which the Axis won World War II, but also perpetuated the image of an aged but still powerful Hitler, ruling over a dystopian world. It's no surprise that Hitler has been portrayed in so many films. In Downfall, his final days in the Berlin bunker became a morbid spectacle, a descent into madness that audiences could observe from the comfort of their seats. The film, while praised for its historical accuracy, also fed the public's morbid curiosity, offering a voyeuristic glimpse into the dictator's downfall. However, the portrayal of Nazism was not limited to Hitler. The Schutzstaffel, SS, became a symbol of evil in its purest form. Films like Schindler's List and Inglourious Basterds not only presented the SS as a killing machine, but also turned it into a visual icon, a symbol of terror that over time has morphed into something darker and more complex. The black SS uniform, with its relentless symmetry and austere lines, became a kind of fetish in popular culture. Hollywood, whether fully aware or perhaps oblivious, transformed this attire into a symbol of power, a power that, despite its association with brutality, began to be admired. Fashion designers drew inspiration from these uniforms, stripping them of their historical context and selling them as style statements, a trend many have called Nazi chic. Fashion, like cinema, has the ability to decontextualize, and in this case it did so with unsettling consequences. In films, Nazis began to be portrayed not only as villains, but as almost theatrical figures, excessive in their evil but also in their charisma. The character of Hans Landa in Inglourious Basterds, masterfully played by Christoph Waltz, is a perfect example of this duality. Landa is both charming and terrifying, a monster with impeccable manners. This portrayal, while effective from a narrative standpoint, diluted the true nature of Nazism, transforming it into a kind of grotesque spectacle rather than a real threat. And so, while audiences applauded the defeat of these villains on screen, Hollywood continued to feed a perverse cycle. The SS, who in reality were agents of genocide and oppression, became symbols of evil that could be inserted into any narrative, regardless of historical context. This detachment allowed Nazi iconography to be used in everything from video games to advertising campaigns, losing its connection to the true horror it represented. The darkest irony, however, lies in the way Hollywood has sexualized and fetishized the female figures of Nazism. Characters like Ilsa, the she-wolf of the SS, not only perverted the historical narrative, but also turned Nazi women into figures of desire, fusing sadism with eroticism. These kinds of representations perpetuate the idea that evil can be attractive, even seductive. But Hollywood's influence didn't stop at the borders of cinema. Music, literature, and other media were also permeated by these portrayals. Composers like Wagner, whose works were promoted by the Nazi regime, continued to be performed. His compositions reverberating in auditoriums filled with listeners who perhaps ignored or preferred to forget the ideological weight of those notes. Literature, for its part, oscillated between critique and exploitation, with novels and essays attempting to decipher the psyche of Nazi leaders, but often ending up romanticizing them. The use of Nazism as a tool of propaganda is not new, but the way it has been perpetuated in popular culture is a testament to its power. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda mastermind, understood better than anyone the importance of controlling the narrative, of repeating a message until it became truth. His principles, though distorted and adapted, are still alive in the way media manipulates public perception, using the same tactics of simplification, emotional appeal, and demonization of opponents. Ultimately, the representation of Nazism in popular culture has created a disturbing paradox. On one hand, it has served to remind the world of the horrors of tyranny and extremism, but on the other, it has contributed to the trivialization and decontextualization of those very horrors. Cinema, music, fashion, and literature have turned the Nazi regime into a symbol, an icon that, while initially representing absolute evil, has been stripped of its historical context, becoming a mere narrative device. Thus, in every frame, every musical note, every written line, the shadow of Nazism continues to loom, not just as a reminder of what was, but as a reflection of what could be. Because in the information age, where images and words are the most powerful weapons, history is not only remembered, it is also rewritten.